Chapter 1. The clock that tick-tocked her name. The clock began ticking precisely at 9:13 p.m. Not before, not after. The guests all remembered the silence of that moment, how the velvet drapes dulled the wind from the gardens, how the chandeliers swayed with no sound, and how Lady Wilmhurst had just lifted her pale hand to ring for coffee when the grandfather clock in the hallway let out a sharp, unexpected tick-tock, tick-tock. It had not functioned for 27 years. The dining room of Larchmore House was the kind of place where secrets clung to the woodwork. Heavy portraits lined the walls, men in powdered wigs and women who stared out as if waiting for something to be confessed. A fire flickered half-heartedly in the hearth, casting the table's occupants in alternating light and shadow. 8 people sat at the long mahogany table. 1 would be dead within the hour. Lady Wilmhurst, the hostess, was a woman of angles, cheekbones sharp, voice clipped, eyes tired from years of keeping up appearances. She wore mourning black, though her husband had died 5 years prior. Across from her sat her goddaughter, Celeste Hartley, golden-haired, beautiful, and desperately trying to appear unbothered. She sipped her wine with the measured grace of someone pretending they hadn't just received a letter threatening to destroy them. To Celeste's left sat Edwin Carruthers, solicitor and family confidant, with fingers that twitched near the wine-glass as though itching to tear open more wills. He had a curious tick. He clicked his thumbnail against his tooth when deep in thought. It happened often that evening. Beside him, Lady Wilmhurst's cousin, Lucien Bellemare, a French art historian with the smooth composure of a man who'd gotten away with more than he let on. His glances were small arrows, aimed quietly toward Celeste. He noticed everything and offered nothing. A few seats down, Major Godfrey Prewitt leaned back with an exasperated grunt. The kind of man who considered subtlety an inconvenience, he spoke loudly and often. "That bloody clock's a nuisance," he muttered, but no one answered. "Perhaps it wishes to be heard," offered Miss Eloise Featherby, the retired governess. Her tone was quiet, though not without a trace of menace. She always wore navy, never smiled, had taught 3 generations of Wilmhursts and not once taken a holiday. Then there was Matilda Crane, distant cousin and constant observer, who appeared to be sketching something beneath the table with a soft, smudged pencil. She claimed to be working on a novel about grief, though none had seen a page. Her eyes darted to the clock again. Tick-tock. And finally, there was Horace Bligh, the horologist, a man of small frames and nervous habits, who'd arrived earlier that day to appraise the old clocks of Larchmore House. He had been drawn to the long, silent grandfather piece in the hallway like a priest to a forbidden altar. When it began ticking, his hand visibly trembled. Lady Wilmhurst cleared her throat. "I was under the impression, Mr. Bligh, that this particular clock was beyond repair." He looked up from his plate of untouched roast duck. "Yes, my lady, it was. I examined the mechanisms myself. They're broken. There's no logical reason for it to be ticking." "None." Eloise Featherby's thin lips curved into a smile. "Clocks know things. Time has a memory. Perhaps it remembers a name." Silence fell like a velvet curtain. The clock continued. At 9:43 p.m., the maid Clarissa entered with the coffee tray. She was pale. Her hands shook. No one paid attention to her, save Poirot. He sat at the far end of the table, an invited guest, though not well known to most of the company. His presence had been arranged quietly by Lady Wilmhurst, who had recently begun receiving unsigned notes. "The past is ticking," they said. "The hour is near." She did not believe in ghosts, but she did believe in fear. Poirot, dressed in a grey silk suit with a napkin folded into a perfect triangle, looked smaller than one might expect for a man so often whispered about in newspapers. His eyes, however, were impossibly focused, like glass buttons catching firelight. He watched Clarissa pour the coffee. She hesitated near Miss Featherby, then again near Celeste. Her fingers trembled as she set the sugar bowl down. Something in her movements was wrong, but delicately wrong. A hesitation too long. A glance she should not have made. Poirot narrowed his eyes, said nothing. At 10:04 p.m., Celeste rose first. "Excuse me," she murmured. "The wine? I think I need air." She left the room quickly, brushing past Horace Bligh, who muttered an apology he hadn't meant. At 10:16 p.m., a scream echoed from the hallway. Lucien was the first to reach her. Poirot arrived moments later, calm as a man attending a rehearsal. Celeste Hartley lay at the base of the ticking clock, her eyes wide open, one hand clenched around the hem of her satin dress. She was dead. Her lips were faintly blue. On the floor beside her was the teacup she had carried from the dining room, a smear of lipstick on its rim. Poirot bent slowly and picked up the cup. He looked to Horace Bligh. "Monsieur," he said, "I believe your clock has struck." The clock ticked once more, then stopped. Poirot straightened, his voice silk-wrapped steel. "There is a poison in this house, and I do not speak only of the cup." And with that, the affair began. Chapter 2. The first clues. The stillness that followed Celeste Hartley's death was unlike any silence that had come before it. It was not merely the absence of sound, it was the stunned recoil of a house realizing it had just borne witness to something irreversible. Lady Wilmhurst stood at the edge of the hall like a statue cast in disbelief. "Get Dr. Lowell," she said at last, her voice as brittle as the porcelain vase beside her, "and do not let anyone leave this house." Poirot did not respond immediately. He crouched near Celeste's body, his fingertips lightly brushing the parquet floor, not quite touching her, but circling the clues she might have left in death. Her hand had indeed clenched a portion of her dress. He carefully loosened her fingers. A shred of pink satin and something else. A long strand of fine thread, barely visible in the dim light, but unmistakably red. It hadn't come from her dress. He looked again at the teacup she had dropped. No obvious odor, no strange discoloration, but Poirot's nostrils flared ever so slightly as he brought it closer to his nose. "Bitter almonds," he murmured, almost inaudibly. "A cyanide-based poison, perhaps. Swift, brutal, precise." Lucien Bellemare stood close behind him, his arms folded. She seemed entirely well moments before, laughing even. Poirot stood, slowly brushing invisible dust from his cuffs. And yet Mademoiselle Hartley now lies dead. Was it the wine? The coffee? Something else? His tone carried no accusation, only calculation. Dr. Lowell arrived within 10 minutes, a brisk, balding man with a perpetually exasperated air. After examining the body, he turned to Lady Wilmhurst, shaking his head. "Rapid cyanosis, discoloration around the lips and extremities. I can confirm that she is dead, but I cannot certify anything further until after a full post-mortem." "Which will take days," Lady Wilmhurst said, pressing a hand to her mouth. "And in the meantime, I have a murderer in my house." Poirot's gaze wandered to the nearby side table. A small framed photograph had fallen over, perhaps during Celeste's collapse. He picked it up, a black and white portrait of a younger Lady Wilmhurst with her late husband and a teenage Celeste standing between them. Celeste's eyes in the photograph held something peculiar, a stiffness, perhaps, or a distance. Not quite belonging, not quite safe. "Madame," Poirot said softly, "I will need access to Mademoiselle Hartley's personal quarters, and to interview each of your guests individually." Lady Wilmhurst's nod was mechanical. "Of course. Do what you must." Clarissa, the maid, had been lingering at the staircase. She flinched when Poirot turned his attention to her. "You carried the coffee service," he said. "Was Mademoiselle Hartley's cup prepared in the same manner as the others?" Clarissa's lips trembled. Yes, monsieur. I set them all on the tray as usual. Lady Wilmhurst takes hers black, and Miss Featherby likes 3 sugars. So I marked hers with a lace doily underneath. But the rest were the same. Poirot raised a single brow. You say Lady Wilmhurst's was black, and the others? With cream and 1 sugar. Except for Mr. Bellemare. He declined. He paused. And the teacup for Mademoiselle Hartley, did you mark it in any way? Clarissa looked down. No, sir? No doily, no token? No, sir. Then how did you ensure she received the correct cup? Clarissa blinked. I didn't think. She just picked one. I think it was the 3rd from the left on the silver tray. Poirot nodded. Merci, mademoiselle. That will be all, for now. As Clarissa hurried away, Poirot turned to Hastings, who had stood quietly near the staircase throughout. Mon ami, Poirot said, note how the details begin to peel themselves from the surface. This is no simple act of murder. It is a carefully staged performance. Hastings furrowed his brow. But surely, Poirot, if the cups weren't marked, then how could the killer know which one she'd take? Ah, Poirot said with a small smile. Either they knew her habits well enough to predict her choice, or they were prepared for anyone to die. They moved to the drawing-room, where the other guests had gathered in uneasy silence. Major Prewitt was pacing. I told you that damn clock was a warning, he spat. It's cursed, I tell you. Miss Featherby tutted softly. There are no curses, Major, just unresolved sins. Lucien turned to Poirot. Do you believe this was deliberate? I mean, perhaps it was a mistake. Celeste, she could have taken the wrong cup, or... Poirot lifted a hand. We shall explore every possibility, monsieur, including the most uncomfortable. He moved to the tray, still set neatly near the corner of the dining table. The coffee pot was half full. 7 cups, 1 empty, 1 partially drained. Matilda Crane's. The rest untouched. He examined each cup's rim, noting the lipstick stains, the faint rings, the positioning. Then he turned to Matilda, whose notebook now sat closed beside her on the side table. Madame, he said gently, you are a writer, no? A student of grief. I observe, she replied. Then tell me, what did you observe tonight before the clock began to tick? Matilda blinked slowly. Celeste was nervous. Her hand kept twitching under the table. She reached for her necklace 3 times, only she wasn't wearing one. Poirot's head tilted. Indeed. She always wears pearls, a family heirloom. She said they were her shield. But tonight, they were gone. Perhaps she felt she no longer needed protection, Miss Featherby said quietly. Or perhaps she finally realized it could not protect her. Poirot let the remark hang. As the room descended once again into silence, the wind outside picked up. A window somewhere moaned softly in protest. Poirot looked once more to the hallway. The clock stood mute, but its voice still echoed in the air. Tick-tock, tick. Time, Poirot thought, had spoken. Now, it was up to him to understand what it had said. Chapter 3. The Gathering of Suspects. By morning, the rooms of Larchmore House had grown taut with suspicion. Breakfast was a strained affair. The sun slanted through the tall windows of the morning room, illuminating the toast crumbs and untasted coffee that littered the table. No one ate much. No one spoke unless spoken to. Lady Wilmhurst sat at the head of the table, her spine rigid, her teacup held with a trembling grace. The events of the night before had left her face drawn and her complexion ashen, yet her presence remained commanding. I trust, Monsieur Poirot, she said carefully. You have a plan to uncover who has done this. It cannot be allowed to fester in the air like mildew. Poirot inclined his head from the other end of the table. Indeed, madame, it is always my method to clear the mildew from the corners. One does not merely open windows. One must scrub the surfaces. No? He dabbed his lips with a linen napkin and stood, clasping his hands behind his back. This morning, I shall begin with individual interviews, not interrogations. Non, only conversations. But I ask that no one leave the house and that no one confer too closely with another, eh bien? We must allow the truth to rise as cream in the milk. The Major scoffed into his napkin. Cream rises, yes, but lies sink and stay there. Not if stirred, Poirot replied softly. The guests were dismissed, and one by one they were summoned into the small blue study off the main hall, a room lined with books Lady Wilmhurst admitted she had never read, their leather spines more decorative than informative. First came Lucien Bellemare. He moved with quiet poise, folding himself neatly into the chair opposite Poirot, legs crossed, hands resting lightly on the arms. A tragedy, he murmured. Celeste was delicate, yes? A soul like a candle in the wind. Yet you did not rise when she collapsed, Poirot said. Lucien blinked. I did. Only a moment after. Shock, perhaps. She and we had a certain history. Nothing recent, of course. But I knew her in Paris. Years ago. Romantically? Lucien hesitated. Briefly. She ended it, or rather, I believe she intended to. But she returned here to England not long after. I heard nothing for years. Poirot studied him. And when you saw her again? Lucien's smile was faint and tight. We pretended to be strangers. It was easier. Easier for whom? Lucien didn't answer. Poirot let the silence linger. Next came Eloise Featherby. She entered with a serenity that unnerved even Poirot, her hands folded neatly over her navy skirt, her eyes unreadable behind round spectacles. You may ask, she said before he could speak, but I doubt I can be of much help. I taught that girl. She was clever in a quiet, slippery way. You did not like her? She needed attention too badly, Featherby said flatly. But not from books. She wanted admiration, validation. She would provoke her father simply to be noticed. After he died, she flitted between benefactors, Lady Wilmhurst among them. But a child who learns early how to manipulate affection never really stops. Poirot leaned forward slightly. Did she manipulate yours? Certainly not. I'm immune to flattery. And to guilt? Miss Featherby narrowed her eyes. What are you suggesting, monsieur? Nothing, mademoiselle. Only that immunity is often something one must train into oneself. It rarely arrives naturally. Next came Matilda Crane, who brought her notebook and a faint air of theatrical melancholy. She sat before Poirot and turned the pages slowly, revealing sketches. Celeste sipping wine, Celeste touching her temple, Celeste standing beside the clock. You draw what you fear, she said. I feared she would die. Did you tell anyone of this fear? No, she said. I rarely speak what I see. It's safer that way. Safer for whom? She smiled. For me. Poirot pointed to a particular sketch of Celeste's hand, a bracelet missing, but a thin mark suggesting one had been worn earlier. Was this imagined? Matilda looked away. She took it off during dinner. I saw her slip something into her handbag, beneath the table. Do you know what it was? A chain with a small vial, like a perfume pendant. Poirot's brow lifted. Interesting. Thank you, madame. The interviews continued with Horace Bligh, who fidgeted from the moment he entered. I didn't do anything, Monsieur Poirot, he insisted. I swear it. I don't even know the girl. I came here for the clocks. Poirot folded his arms. But the one that began to tick, the one declared beyond repair, it ticked at the moment of a murder. That is a most precise coincidence. I didn't touch it. Horace's voice cracked. I examined it, yes, but I couldn't fix it. I told Lady Wilmhurst that. Its mechanisms rusted through. There's no pendulum swing. The chime gears are stuck. And yet, It started ticking. He stared at Poirot, wild-eyed. You think I did something unnatural, but I didn't. I'm not clever enough for murder. Many murderers are not clever, Poirot said, rising. But they are desperate. Finally, he interviewed Major Prewitt, who thundered into the study as if trying to chase the ghost of Celeste out with his boots. I don't like being questioned like a criminal, he began. You are not being questioned, Poirot replied. You are being observed. The Major bristled. I barely knew the girl. She was far too modern for my tastes. Always looking at phones, playing music that didn't sound like music. You know the sort. Poirot tilted his head. Yet you were heard arguing with her 3 nights ago, something about decency and reputation. Prewitt's face darkened. She made an accusation, said I was the reason her inheritance was being delayed. Rubbish. I'd merely asked Lady Wilmhurst whether it was wise to bestow a fortune on someone so volatile. Volatile. She changed moods like the wind, laughing 1 minute, biting the next. It wasn't healthy. Poirot made a small note. Merci, Major. That will be all. As the door closed behind him, Poirot stood alone in the study. He looked to the clock on the mantel, a different one than the hallway piece. This one ticked quietly, its face clean and regular. He watched it for a long moment. One clock had told time, another had told murder, and somewhere in this house, someone had been counting on both. Chapter 4. Poirot arrives. Technically, Hercule Poirot had arrived the previous evening, invited discreetly by Lady Wilmhurst weeks before the tragedy, but no one had understood the true nature of his presence until after the ticking began. Until after Celeste Hartley lay dead beneath a clock that should not have moved. Now on the morning following her death, Poirot truly arrived. Not in pomp or dramatic flair, he required no audience for that. His arrival was in method, the quiet claiming of a house with his mind. He walked slowly. With precision, eyes roaming along cornices and mantelpieces, taking in dust patterns, finger marks, mismatched picture frames. He listened not only to voices, but to silences. He moved like a needle, stitching together a fabric no one else yet knew existed. Lady Wilmhurst found him in the portrait gallery after his morning interviews. Her face, still lined with fatigue, had taken on a sharper cast. You've spoken to everyone, I take it? Yes, madame, Poirot said gently, hands folded behind his back. And they have all spoken to me, some truthfully, some carefully, some not at all. Will you be notifying the police? Ça. Poirot turned toward a long ancestral portrait. A Wilmhurst patriarch, painted in dark oils, gazing over an imaginary battlefield. Of course, the local constabulary has already been summoned. But you did not bring me here because you wished to let the law handle this, did you? Her expression twitched. The law is useful in principle, but you are, how shall I say, more precise. Poirot gave a modest bow. I do not wear a uniform, madame, but I too serve justice. Only I wear it tailored. She didn't smile. You believe someone in this house poisoned her? Poirot turned from the painting. No one else could have done so. The circle is closed. The cup was on the tray. The poison was likely introduced either just before or just after serving. It was an act both intimate and premeditated. And you think it was meant for her? Poirot paused. I am not yet certain. Mademoiselle Hartley was not universally adored, but she was not, on the surface, an obvious threat to anyone. If the cup was random, then anyone could have died. That suggests one kind of mind. If it was deliberate, then it reveals another. Lady Wilmhurst's voice dropped. If you are implying that someone in my family would resort to murder, Poirot lifted a single finger. I imply nothing. But the past, madame, it does not remain politely in the drawing-room. It spills into the present, into the china cups, into the air. She looked at him long and hard, then turned on her heel and left. Poirot remained in the gallery, studying the faces in frames. Generations of Wilmhursts, each stiff with oil and time. Somewhere in the genealogy, he thought, were seeds. Pride, inheritance, secrets, buried motives. It was Hastings who found him half an hour later. "The police have arrived," he said, a little breathless. "Inspector Rivington, I believe. Looks like a fox terrier in uniform." Poirot chuckled softly. "Excellent. Let us meet this terrier." In the main drawing room, Inspector Rivington stood with his arms crossed, examining a notepad with obvious discomfort. A lean man with thinning hair and thick eyebrows, he exuded a certain mistrust of anything not written in his handbook. "So," he said as Poirot entered, "you're the fellow Lady Wilmhurst brought in. Belgian, yes?" Poirot gave a small bow. "Correct. Hercule Poirot, at your service. And you are the Inspector Rivington I've heard of, efficient, methodical, and admirably fond of proper procedure." Rivington blinked. "Quite. Well, yes, that's me, though I don't usually have to take over a case from someone already in the middle of it." "You do not take over, mon ami," Poirot said kindly. "You and I work parallel." Rivington snorted. "Two detectives in one house. Let's hope we don't solve each other." Poirot offered a gracious smile. "I am rarely mysterious." The inspector closed his notepad. Victim's name was Celeste Hartley. Died during coffee. Body already sent for post-mortem. Doctor suspects cyanide. You believe the poison was in the coffee?" "I do," Poirot said, "but the method is less important to me than the intent. Why someone wished her dead, that is where the truth resides." "You think this is personal?" Poirot nodded. "It nearly always is." Rivington looked around at the assembled guests, who had been summoned once more into the drawing room. They stood in uneasy groupings. Lucien by the fireplace, Featherby in a wing-backed chair, Matilda scribbling faintly on the margins of a newspaper. The Major paced like a lion. Poirot stepped forward, addressing them not as an accuser, but as a conductor tuning an orchestra. "Monsieur et mesdames," he said, "you're all still in mourning, yes? But it is now that the work begins. I must ask you to be patient and truthful and precise. Because the truth, like poison, is often colorless, but never without effect." He turned to Horace Bly. "Monsieur, I must again speak with you regarding the clock." Horace paled. "I already told you, I didn't fix it. But you were near it. You examined it. Tell me, if someone were to tamper with it, could it be made to tick for a brief while? Just long enough to draw attention?" Horace hesitated. "Theoretically, yes. If you gently nudged the pendulum and applied a tiny amount of oil to the gears, it might tick, but only briefly, and only if someone had intimate knowledge of the workings. Someone like yourself." "I wouldn't." Horace's voice cracked. Poirot simply nodded. "Very well." The group dispersed again, some muttering, some silent. Poirot remained, standing beside the silent fireplace, alone with Hastings. "What do you make of it all?" Hastings asked. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Someone wished her silenced, whether for what she knew, what she possessed, or what she threatened, I do not yet know. But I sense fear in this house, mon ami. Not panic, not grief. Fear." He looked toward the hallway. The clock stood there still, its hands frozen. "It ticked once," Poirot murmured. "But the true countdown, I fear, has only just begun." Chapter 5. Initial Interviews. The rain began just after noon, first as a drizzle threading its way through the hedgerows, then intensifying into a steady tap-tap against the windows of Larchmore House. Poirot welcomed it. Rain softened the nerves, lulled the impatient into disclosures, and lent everything a deeper quiet. It was under that grey hush that he resumed his work. Inspector Rivington had allowed Poirot a free hand in the interviews, though he made a show of sitting in a corner with a notepad he rarely touched. He was observant in a mechanical way, eyes sharp, but thoughts unassembled. Poirot preferred it that way. It gave him room to feel the temperature of a conversation, not merely take its measurements. The first to be called was Miss Eloise Featherby. She entered the study with the same austere calm she always wore, her umbrella still dripping faintly in the stand by the door. "I have nothing new to add," she said without preamble, settling into the chair opposite Poirot. "Even repetition," Poirot replied, "can sometimes become revelation." She gave him a dry smile. "You believe I know more than I've said. I believe you observe more than you admit." Featherby tilted her head. "That's not quite the same." "No," Poirot agreed. "But you taught Celeste. You knew her longer than anyone in this house." "Was she happy here?" Featherby was quiet a moment. She had moments of happiness, but happiness wasn't her baseline. She was always reaching for something: love, approval, legacy. She resented that she had to inherit it rather than earn it. Poirot leaned forward. "Did she ever confide in you recently? Was she anxious? Fearful?" "No," she said. Then after a pause, she asked about the will. "The Wilmhurst will?" "Yes. She wanted to know when it would be finalized. She said something odd, that it had been tampered with by sentiment." I didn't press. Poirot nodded slowly. "And you said she removed her usual necklace at dinner. Have you seen it since?" "I have not." He made a small note. "Merci, mademoiselle." Next came Lucien Bellemare. He arrived with a faint scent of cologne and a deliberate calm that made Poirot's instincts prickle. "You asked yesterday if the poison might have been meant for someone else," Poirot began. Lucien nodded. "Yes." "Did you mean yourself?" Lucien hesitated. "Perhaps. There was a time long ago when Celeste had reason to resent me. Something romantic. A misunderstanding. I distanced myself. She had attachments, dangerous ones. Men who were not what they seemed. I warned her. She thought I was jealous. And now?" Lucien folded his hands. "I had no wish to revive the past." Poirot tilted his head. "Tell me, monsieur, were you surprised to see her here this weekend?" Lucien looked up slowly. "I was. I'd been told she was abroad." "By whom?" He hesitated, then said, "Lady Wilmhurst. A month ago, in correspondence. She said Celeste had gone to the continent. I assumed she would not be here." Poirot made no comment, only raised an eyebrow. Lucien smiled faintly. "You think I lie?" "I think, monsieur," Poirot said, "that you forget how often the truth travels in half measures." Matilda Crane was next. She carried a new page in her notebook and placed it delicately on Poirot's desk. It was a sketch of a cup, Celeste's to be precise, with arrows drawn around the rim. "I remember odd details," she said. "Perhaps because I'm always looking for metaphor." She didn't sip immediately. She stared into the cup first, turned it, smiled at it oddly, then drank. She smiled. A wry smile, as if she were reading something in the foam. Poirot studied the drawing. Was it the same cup she picked up before leaving the dining room? Yes. I noticed because it had a faint chip on the handle. Poirot stood, walked to the silver tray still in the dining room, now covered by a glass dome. He found the chipped cup. Indeed, a barely perceptible notch along the handle. "She chose her own cup," he murmured, "deliberately." "Not randomly," he returned to the study. "Matilda, what do you think she saw in it?" "She once told me," Matilda said slowly, "that she had learned to spot lies in reflections. She said the truth always distorts the surface differently." Poirot looked thoughtful. "She was searching for truth, and found death." Matilda gave him a sad smile. Perhaps they were the same thing in her case. After a pause, Horace Bly was summoned. He entered nervously, clutching a small notepad of his own. I wrote some thoughts down, he stammered, about the clock. Please, Poirot said, gesturing for him to sit. Horace flipped the pad open. The clock had no power source, no wound spring, and yet it ticked. Someone must have used the escape gear, maybe with oil to simulate motion. Poirot watched him carefully. Could such a trick be timed precisely? Horace nodded. If you warmed the gear, the lubrication thins, letting it slip just enough. Someone could have triggered it subtly, by brushing past maybe. So it was theatre, Poirot said quietly. A signal, a distraction. Yes, Horace said. But why? To unsettle her? Or to mark the moment? Poirot didn't answer. His mind was turning, slowly but without pause. Major Prewitt was last. He arrived with more bluster than insight. She's dead, that's tragedy enough, he said. But this circus of interviews, it's unnecessary. You believe it was an accident? I believe it was madness. She lived in her head too much. Women like that, they get swallowed by their own imaginations. Poirot studied him. You were quite heated with her earlier this week. She made claims about me. Nonsense. I raised a voice, perhaps. But I don't poison girls. I fight wars. Poirot did not respond. Instead he stood. Merci, monsieur. You may go. When the door closed, Hastings leaned in. You don't trust him. I trust no one yet, Poirot replied. But tell me, Hastings, if a young woman were to suspect someone of plotting her death, how might she arrange to test that theory? By pretending to be vulnerable, Hastings said slowly, by baiting the trap. Exactly. Poirot walked to the rain-streaked window and looked out at the garden, where two peacocks stood unmoving in the drizzle. Celeste Hartley, he said quietly, may not have been a victim who was caught, but one who stepped knowingly into the snare. And outside, somewhere in the hedgerows and turning shadows of Larch Moor, the truth waited, growing darker with the rain. Chapter 6. The first false lead. By late afternoon, Larchmore House felt more like a stage than a home. The air was too still, the walls too listening. Poirot moved through it all as a conductor of silence, each step purposeful, each glance a question. And then, as often happens in such cases, a thread too neatly placed began to tug at its own unraveling. The postman arrived at 3 o'clock. The staff knew better than to interrupt, but Clarissa brought the bundle to Poirot directly, her hands half curled with tension. This one's marked urgent, she whispered. Came by hand. Poirot turned the letter in his palm, heavy cream stock, sealed in red wax with an unfamiliar crest. He broke it open and unfolded the contents, a single sheet, a typed note. If Celeste Hartley is dead, then justice is too late. But know this, the man who delivered the poison wears a uniform not of war, but of habit. He walks with medals, but his hands are not clean. I watched from the garden. He did it. Ask about the teacup he touched. There was no signature, just a faint trace of smudged ink, as if the writer had hesitated before folding the page. Poirot handed it silently to Inspector Rivington, who had arrived shortly before for an update. The inspector read it twice, jaw tightening. This is an accusation. Clear as day. Or a misdirection, Poirot said, folding his arms. But yes, it names Major Prewitt, does it not? He wears a uniform, after all. He does. Though whether out of pride or to hide something is another matter. They found the Major in the library, a glass of sherry in his hand, and an open volume of naval history before him. Poirot gestured to the chair opposite. Major, forgive the intrusion. You're always intruding, Poirot, he said, setting down the glass. That's your job, I suppose. A note has arrived, an anonymous one. It claims that you touched Celeste's teacup before it was served. Prewitt's eyes narrowed. I did no such thing. Poirot tilted his head. Are you certain? Perhaps in passing. A careless brush while the tray was being moved. The cup was not marked, but she chose it precisely. If someone wanted her to take that one. Prewitt stood sharply. Now hold on. Are you suggesting I arranged that? That I poisoned a girl in front of a room full of people? Someone did. Or someone wants it to appear that way. Rivington stepped forward. The note suggests you have something to hide, Major, that your hands are not clean. Would you mind explaining where you were in the moments just before the coffee was served? Prewitt barked a short laugh. I was in the dining room, same as everyone else. I spoke to Lucien about that ridiculous sculpture in the conservatory. Ask him? We shall, Poirot said calmly. But one more thing. Did you see anyone else near the coffee tray before Clarissa brought it in? The Major hesitated. No. Or rather, I suppose Matilda walked past it. She hovered around the sideboard a lot. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Thank you, Major. That will be all for now. As he exited the library, Poirot turned to Hastings, who had been watching quietly. Do you see it? I see a man with motive and no charm. Poirot smiled faintly. Yes, but charm is rarely a shield against guilt. What matters is opportunity and control. Rivington joined them in the hall. Do you believe the note? Poirot tapped the paper. It is too neat, too dramatic. The language is theatrical. Justice is too late. He walks with medals. This is not the voice of someone seeking law. It is someone composing a performance. You think it's false? I think it is bait, and I never bite too quickly. Still, suspicion grew. That evening, the house stirred uneasily. Conversations shrank to whispers. Even Lady Wilmhurst seemed on edge, her hands tightening on the arms of her chair whenever Prewitt entered a room. At dinner, no one touched the coffee. Poirot watched the dynamics unfold, the way Lucien's eyes flicked toward Matilda, how Clarissa kept glancing nervously at the silver tray, how Featherby traced an invisible circle on the tablecloth with her thumb. Afterwards, Poirot took Clarissa aside in the butler's pantry. You handled the tray yesterday, he said gently, and you delivered it. She nodded. Did the Major come near it? She bit her lip. He stood near the sideboard, but he didn't touch anything, at least not while I was watching. Poirot leaned closer. Is there something you're afraid to say? She hesitated, then whispered. There was a moment. When I went to fetch the sugar bowl from the kitchen, I left the tray unattended, just for a minute. When I returned, it looked shifted. The cups weren't exactly how I'd placed them. I thought I'd made a mistake. But now, who was nearby? She swallowed. Matilda Crane. Poirot's expression did not change. Merci, Clarissa. Later, in his guest room, Poirot sat with Hastings beneath the low yellow light of the bedside lamp. The clock ticked softly on the mantel. She is a careful killer, Hastings, Poirot murmured. Celeste? No, her murderer. She was reckless, perhaps, but the one who silenced her was precise. The poison was fast, the timing theatrical, the note misleading, and now the first false lead has been planted, clearly, purposefully. You don't think the Major did it? No, Poirot said simply, but someone wants us to. Hastings frowned. But if Matilda tampered with the tray, why point to Prewitt? Poirot's eyes narrowed. Because the real killer knows how we think. They know the house's tensions, its little resentments. They do not wish only to hide. They wish to direct. Outside, the rain had paused. The moon pressed faint silver onto the garden paths. Poirot stood and drew the curtains. Someone, he said, is crafting a narrative. But sooner or later, Hastings, they will forget one detail, one inconsistency. One truth that does not fit the story. He turned, his eyes sharp as glass. And then, mon ami, the unraveling will begin. Chapter 7. The Psychological Game. It was just after dawn when Poirot began to play his game, not with dice or cards, but with pauses, silences, and carefully chosen words. Psychological pressure, when applied subtly, can unravel even the most carefully curated composure. And Larchmore House, heavy with layered tensions, was fertile ground for such unraveling. Breakfast was again quiet, save for the occasional clink of spoon against china. The guests took their seats as if summoned by fate rather than hunger. Poirot, freshly shaven and sharply dressed, appeared last, his small frame cutting an elegant shape in the doorway. "Bon matin, mes amis," he said brightly, though his tone was almost too cheerful. It drew a wary glance from Miss Featherby and a cautious twitch of Lucien's eyebrow. "Sleep well?" the Major grunted, buttering his toast with unnecessary vigor. "Impeccably," Poirot replied, taking a seat beside Hastings. "The walls speak very softly at night in Larchmore House. Or rather, they whisper in the cracks." Lucien gave a strained smile. "And what do these whispering cracks say, Monsieur Poirot?" "That truth is a restless guest," Poirot said lightly. "But lies get far too comfortable." No one replied. After breakfast, Poirot requested that Matilda Crane join him on the veranda, where a weak sun filtered through mist onto the dew-streaked furniture. She brought her notebook again, though this time she kept it closed. "Mademoiselle," Poirot began, "I admire those who see life through metaphor. But tell me, why did you sketch Celeste's hand the night before she died?" Matilda looked out across the hedges. "Because it was trembling." "You did not mention this before." "I wasn't certain, and you don't always mention tremors. Some people shake forever." Poirot nodded. "True, but it was a particular tremor, yes? A frightened one." She didn't answer immediately. She looked at me during dinner. Her eyes. It was like she was asking a question without words. Then she touched her sleeve and moved her fingers as if counting something. "Counting?" Poirot asked. "Or tracing?" Matilda murmured. "I thought it was odd. Like muscle memory." Poirot studied her face. "You were alone in the dining room for a time before the coffee. Clarissa confirms it. What were you doing?" She looked at him, unblinking. "I was reading a note Celeste had dropped. I found it beside her seat. I don't think she meant to lose it." Poirot's eyebrows lifted. "And where is this note now?" "I burned it," Matilda said quietly. "You destroyed evidence?" "I was frightened. The note was personal, full of fury. It said, 'I know what you did. You stole what was mine. I'm going to speak, and you can't stop me this time.'" "Was it signed?" "No, but you think it was addressed to you?" Matilda hesitated. "I thought it might be, but I wasn't sure. Celeste had her claws in more than one person." Poirot stared into her eyes a long moment. "You have a practiced way of telling truths while concealing meaning, mademoiselle. But I shall find what was in that note, whether in ash or in action." He dismissed her gently and waited 10 minutes before asking Lucien Bellemare to join him in the conservatory. Lucien stepped lightly, hands in his coat pockets, the smell of tobacco lingering on his cuffs. "You're gathering us like chess pieces, Poirot." "Chess requires logic. This," Poirot gestured around the garden, "requires psychology. Tell me, Lucien, what does guilt look like to you?" Lucien smirked. "Sweating, stammering, fear." "Then you believe the guilty reveal themselves?" "Always." "Then," Poirot said softly, "do you know what fear looks like in you?" The smile faltered. Poirot stepped closer. "You told me Lady Wilmhurst said Celeste was abroad, but Lady Wilmhurst denies ever saying this. She claims you already knew Celeste was to be present. and that you asked to attend after receiving the invitation list." Lucien's jaw tightened. "So," Poirot continued, "either you lie or she does. And Lady Wilmhurst has no reason to invent that correspondence." "I wanted to avoid confrontation," Lucien said finally. "I hoped she wouldn't come." "You hoped," Poirot repeated. "Or you feared." Lucien said nothing. Poirot allowed the silence to stretch, then asked gently, "Was it money, Lucien? Or something else? Celeste once called you a collector of women's stories. What did she mean by that?" Lucien's lips parted, but he did not speak. Poirot let him leave without further questions. Later, he returned to the drawing room, where Miss Featherby sat with a book she wasn't reading. He approached quietly. "Mademoiselle," he said, "may I pose a hypothetical?" "If you must," she replied, eyes not moving from the page. "If you had knowledge that Celeste Hartley possessed an item of considerable value, say, something she wore regularly, but that item went missing the night she died, would you not consider who might benefit from its absence?" She looked up slowly. "You think I wanted her necklace?" "Not just you," Poirot said. "Several may have had reason. A vial was attached to it, possibly containing something important, perhaps a sample of the poison, perhaps something entirely else. But it is gone." Featherby's expression remained unreadable. "Celeste played with fire, and someone burned her. She made enemies of her protectors. It's a dangerous thing to provoke the people who hold your history." Poirot leaned closer. Whose history did she threaten to expose? Featherby did not blink. "Perhaps all of ours." That evening, Poirot reviewed his notes alone in the study. Hastings beside him, arms folded. "They're all lying," Hastings muttered. Poirot nodded. "Each conceals a thread. Some are petty, some personal. But someone here feared exposure, not of the murder, but of something that came before it. Celeste knew something. She hinted at it in that note Matilda burned. We, and perhaps in her silence, in her gestures, in the way she touched her wrist where her necklace used to be. I believe she brought it with her deliberately. As insurance, she suspected someone might act." Poirot rose and crossed to the fireplace. "Tomorrow," he said, "I will bait the next trap." "Another interview?" "No, a confrontation, but not to accuse, to provoke." He turned, eyes bright with anticipation. For the guilty Hastings, the mind begins to betray the heart, and once that betrayal begins, it cannot be undone. Chapter 8. A Secondary Mystery. It was some time past 11 the following morning when the housekeeper, Mrs. Tillot, came knocking on Poirot's door, her breath short and her face blotched with urgency. "Monsieur Poirot," she gasped, "Lady Wilmhurst's study. It's been ransacked. Everything's turned over." Poirot was already rising, Hastings close behind him. The two followed the housekeeper through the creaking hallway and down toward the eastern wing, where the family's private rooms lined the narrower passage. The door to Lady Wilmhurst's study was ajar. Inside, drawers hung open like broken jaws. Books had been pulled from their shelves and scattered across the rug in disarray. The top of the writing desk had been swept clean of paper, as if someone had wiped their arm across it in frustration. Most damning of all, the lockbox Lady Wilmhurst had spoken of, the one that held the most recent draft of her will, lay pried open and empty. The lady herself stood near the fireplace, her face pale with rage rather than fear. "I've kept that box locked for months," she said. "I only ever open it to review documents. Whoever did this was looking for something very specific." Poirot stepped carefully into the room, eyes moving across the chaos with unnatural calm. "You say you opened it recently?" "Last week. I took out Celeste's letter requesting a change to her clause. She wanted to revise the date she'd receive her full inheritance. I declined, of course. She was to receive it when? On her 27th birthday, which was to be next week. Poirot's brows arched. Ah, so close. Yes, Lady Wilmhurst said tightly, and with her death, her clause becomes complicated. There are fallback beneficiaries. I'm not even certain which takes precedence. The solicitor, Mr. Carruthers, was to advise me. Poirot turned to Hastings. Do you recall Celeste's expression at dinner? That subtle restlessness, the odd glances at her empty neck? I suspect she had brought something here. Proof of some grievance, perhaps. Something she intended to reveal before her birthday. He looked back at the open box. And now it is missing. The inspector arrived moments later, his boots tracking mud onto the carpet. Another break-in, Rivington muttered, eyes sweeping the disarray. This complicates things. Indeed, Poirot said, kneeling beside the writing desk. Though the methods are crude, the timing is not. Someone wanted us distracted. They wish us to believe this is part of the original crime. But I think not. Rivington tilted his head. You think it's new? Yes, a response. An attempt to conceal or retrieve something. Possibly something overlooked after the murder. Something Celeste left behind. As Rivington took photographs and barked questions at the house staff, Poirot's gaze fell upon a small slip of cream paper poking out from beneath the corner of the desk. He retrieved it delicately. It was half a torn envelope. The recipient's name was gone, but the sender's mark remained. A wax seal broken through the middle, and beside it, 2 faint initials in pencil. M.C. Poirot showed it to Hastings. Matilda Crane, he said softly. They found her in the south garden, seated on a stone bench sketching the bare limbs of a winter tree. When Poirot approached, she folded her notebook calmly and looked up. I heard there was a disturbance. A ransacking, Poirot corrected, of Lady Wilmhurst's study. Matilda blinked once. Was anything taken? Yes, a lockbox was emptied. Documents are missing. I assume you think I had reason. I have a fragment of envelope bearing your initials. Found beneath the desk. She said nothing. You admitted yesterday that Celeste had dropped a note, Poirot continued. But this envelope, was this yours? Did you send something to Lady Wilmhurst recently? Matilda looked toward the tree again. Yes, a month ago. I sent her a letter on Celeste's behalf. Celeste was too proud to ask directly. She wanted an early release of funds to support some venture. She told me it was a scholarship in her name. I suspected it wasn't. What did you believe it was for? Matilda met his eyes. I think she was paying someone off. Poirot felt a shiver run along his scalp. A blackmailer, he asked. Perhaps. She never said the word. But she was frightened, and when Celeste is frightened, she masks it with vanity. She had become obsessed with a piece of her past, something she said could break the house. Poirot's voice was almost a whisper. And you still have no idea what it was? Matilda's lips pressed together. She mentioned letters, not hers, old ones, hidden. She was vague, and she said someone in the house would do anything to keep them buried. Poirot straightened, thoughts clicking into place. If Celeste had indeed discovered personal correspondence from years past, letters that implicated someone in scandal, betrayal, or crime, it would explain much. Her cryptic behavior, her apparent control over her fear, and now, the desperation to recover whatever she left behind. Back in the house, Poirot and Hastings made their way to the drawing room. The fire had been rekindled. Lady Wilmhurst, Lucian, Featherby, Prewitt, and Horace Bligh were all present, summoned by Rivington, who read from his notebook like a man unraveling his own patience. Poirot stepped forward. A new mystery joins the old, he announced, hands folded. A study ransacked, a lockbox forced, a packet of letters removed. These are not the actions of a murderer who struck with poison 2 nights ago, but someone who fears what was left behind. Someone who fears that the past will outlive their efforts. Lucien cleared his throat. Are you saying the murderer returned to the scene? No, monsieur, Poirot said gently. I am saying the murderer never left. He let the silence thicken. I ask each of you to consider, who among you knew Celeste's inheritance terms? Who stood to benefit from her death? Immediately. Who knew she had written Lady Wilmhurst? Who believed she had proof? Horace Bligh looked up suddenly. She showed me something once. A letter, handwritten, but it wasn't addressed to her. It was old, and it mentioned the war. The war? Featherby repeated. Yes, Horace said. It mentioned a name. Prewitt. The Major stood at once. That's absurd. Poirot held up a hand. No accusations, please. We gather only evidence. But in Hastings' ear, he whispered, it is always the second crime that gives away the truth. Because now, in the ruins of a broken study and the ashes of old paper trails, a different scent had begun to rise, not one of poison, but of fear. Real fear. The kind that does not hide behind misdirection, the kind that reveals who is running out of time. Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. The rain returned with a heavier mood that evening, drumming against the roof of Larchmore House like 100 unspoken thoughts. Poirot walked the halls with quiet steps, his eyes trained not only on people now, but on relationships, patterns, what the English call undercurrents. Because the truth, he knew, often lived in the spaces between people, not within them. He found Lucien Bellemare by the fireplace in the gentleman's lounge, staring into the flames with a glass of port untouched beside him. May I? Poirot asked, gesturing to the armchair opposite. Lucien nodded without looking up. You don't believe I killed her, do you? Poirot sat slowly. I believe you knew her better than you pretended. Lucien exhaled, then met Poirot's gaze. She was brilliant, he said, and difficult. She would provoke you just to see what you'd reveal. But she wasn't cruel, not really. She was frightened. Of what? Of being discarded, like her mother. Poirot tilted his head. You knew her mother? A little. She was once the companion to Lady Wilmhurst, before Celeste was born. When her mother died, the Wilmhursts took the girl in as a ward, but she was never truly family. There was always a divide. Poirot steepled his fingers. And her father? Lucien looked into the fire again. Rumors. He was married to someone else. A scandal that never fully formed. Poirot nodded slowly. And yet she was to inherit a generous sum. Yes, Lady Wilmhurst had a soft spot for her, but I think she also felt guilt. Guilt? Poirot repeated. Lucien gave him a sideways glance. You should ask about the winter of 1907. There was a fire. Something was lost. Perhaps someone. Poirot said nothing, but his mind moved sharply. Later that evening, Poirot requested that Lady Wilmhurst join him in the music room. She arrived in a dark gown, hair pinned tight, her movements precise. You wish to speak further? She asked, not sitting. Yes, madame. About Celeste's mother. Lady Wilmhurst blinked once. Her name was Genevieve. She came to me after my own daughter was born. She was a nursemaid, soft-spoken, French, I believe. She died when Celeste was only 4. Pneumonia. She lived here. For a time. Poirot observed her carefully. Lucien suggests that Celeste was never truly family, that there was a fracture in her belonging. Lady Wilmhurst's hands tensed slightly. I did what I could for her. She was spirited, quick-tempered, but bright. Was she your daughter's age? My daughter died young, Lady Wilmhurst said, her voice clipped. A fever. At 6. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. Then Celeste grew up in the shadow of that absence. Lady Wilmhurst didn't respond. But there was more, wasn't there? He continued gently. The fire in 1907. What was lost? She looked at him sharply. You've been speaking to people who remember too much, or not enough. Lady Wilmhurst finally sat slowly. The fire started in the East Wing nursery. My daughter had been moved to a different room that week. There were rumors. Whispers that Genevieve had neglected something. A candle, perhaps. There were no official charges, but she was dismissed, sent to the gardener's cottage until her departure. She died a few months later. And Celeste remained. She had nowhere else to go. My husband arranged for her to stay as a ward, but I never quite looked at her the same. She reminded me too much of everything that had been broken. Poirot was silent for a moment. She believed she had found something, a letter perhaps, or a diary, proof of a secret that would alter the legacy of this house, proof she could use. Lady Wilmhurst's face tightened. She would never dare. She dared quite often, Poirot said softly. It was part of her charm. He let her go, then sought out Horace Bly. The horologist had been in the attic with a bundle of tools, inspecting a broken mantel clock he claimed could still be coaxed into speech. He looked startled to see Poirot. Do you need more information about the grandfather clock? He asked. Not today, Poirot said. Today I wish to ask about a woman you once knew, Genevieve Hartley. Horace's eyes widened slightly. How do you know that name? She was Celeste's mother. Yes, I knew her. Only briefly. She lived in the gardener's cottage. I helped fix her kitchen door once. She was quiet. Not quite broken, but fading. I remember thinking she looked like a woman waiting to be erased. Did you ever speak with her? Not much. But once, she gave me a letter. Asked me to hold it for her. Told me to burn it if anything happened to her. Poirot leaned in. And did you? Horace shook his head slowly. I forgot. I found it years later. I didn't understand all of it, but it hinted at things. She named a man, a Wilmhurst. Not the lady's husband. A cousin, I think. Someone who had made promises. Left her with a child. Said she'd been betrayed. Discarded. Do you still have this letter? Horace looked ashamed. I gave it to Celeste. Last summer. She cried when she read it. Said it explained everything. And then she smiled. Said it was time the truth was heard. Poirot felt the weight of that sentence settle into the room. So Celeste had motive, not for revenge, but for revelation. She had perhaps intended to force recognition, to claim a name that had been denied. And someone in Larchmore House, someone with a stake in silence, had panicked. He returned to Hastings, who was seated in the drawing room with Inspector Rivington. They're all connected, Poirot said, through more than proximity, through a chain of debts and griefs, a nursemaid dismissed, a daughter dead, a child raised in a house that refused to name her. And the will? Hastings asked. Poirot nodded. It was not just about money. It was about legitimacy, about acknowledgement. Celeste believed the documents she found would finally force that. But they're gone now, Rivington said. Stolen. Poirot gave a faint smile. Perhaps not. Perhaps they have simply moved. He turned toward the hallway, where Clarissa, the maid, stood quietly, holding a tray. Clarissa, Poirot said gently, would you join me in the morning room? The girl flinched slightly but nodded. As she followed him down the corridor, Poirot's eyes gleamed, not with triumph, but with understanding. The mystery had begun with a cup of poisoned coffee, but now it had grown larger than death. It had become a reckoning. Chapter 10. Poirot's secret clue. The morning room was quiet and dim, its high windows half fogged by the weight of a storm not yet broken. Poirot sat in one of the upholstered chairs, legs delicately crossed, fingers folded beneath his chin. Clarissa stood near the threshold, not yet fully inside, as if crossing that carpet meant stepping into something she could not reverse. "Come in, mademoiselle," Poirot said kindly, gesturing to the chair opposite. "There is no need to be afraid. I merely wish to understand something, and you, I think, are the only one who can help me do so." Clarissa obeyed, though her eyes remained low. Her apron was spotless, but her shoes were damp with morning dew, and her hands bore faint ink stains along the sides of her fingers. "You know this house well," Poirot began. "You know its patterns, its silences. But tell me, what did you find the morning after Celeste's death, before the police arrived?" Clarissa blinked, startled. I didn't touch anything." "I do not ask if you tampered," Poirot said gently. "I ask what you saw." She hesitated, then slowly said, "In the dining room, after everyone had gone. I was clearing the sideboard, and I saw something tucked beneath the cushion of the high-backed chair at the far end." "Which chair?" "The one Lucien sat in." Poirot's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "And what was it?" "A folded paper, heavy parchment. I opened it just a little. It looked like a letter, and it had a seal. A red wax seal." She nodded. "What did you do with it?" "I gave it to Lady Wilmhurst," she said quietly. "I didn't think, well, I assumed it was hers. Or at least something private." Poirot nodded slowly, lips pressed into a fine line. "You did not consider that it might belong to Celeste?" Clarissa's mouth opened. I didn't think she would leave something behind." "But she did," Poirot said, "and someone tried very hard to make sure it was never seen." He stood, pacing once toward the window and back. "Clarissa, I must ask you one more thing. Do you know where Lady Wilmhurst keeps her personal correspondence? Not in the study, the personal papers, the things she doesn't want her solicitor to see." Clarissa looked torn. "There's a drawer in the music cabinet. She told me never to dust it, which meant, of course, I always did." Poirot gave a small smile. Human nature, no? Moments later, with Clarissa's nervous assistance and Hastings quietly guarding the door, Poirot opened the lower drawer of the antique music cabinet. Beneath a stack of unused sheet music, wedged between the sonatas and nocturnes, he found a sheaf of yellowed paper bound with a blue ribbon. The seal on the topmost page was broken, but unmistakable. The same wax, the same crest that had appeared on the torn envelope in the study days before. Hastings leaned in. "What is it?" Poirot unwrapped the ribbon and skimmed the pages. His eyes did not widen, nor did his expression shift much. But the stillness that overtook him was unmistakable. "These," he said softly, "are the letters Celeste was using as leverage." He handed the first page to Hastings. It was dated 27 years ago. The handwriting was masculine, sweeping, and unmistakably intimate. "You know I cannot acknowledge her, not publicly, but she will want for nothing. I promise you that. What we had was not a mistake, though it must be treated like one. You were never just her nursemaid, but now it must end." Hastings whistled softly. "So it's true." "Oui," Poirot murmured. Celeste was not merely a ward. She was blood, not of Lady Wilmhurst's husband, but of his cousin. The Wilmhurst legacy was already precarious, and a scandal like this would have fractured it. A daughter born of infidelity, hidden behind closed doors, left to be raised among the ashes. Celeste found these? She did. Horace gave her at least one, and likely she searched for the rest, piecing together the truth. She intended to reveal it, perhaps even to demand full legal recognition. Maybe she wanted more than her inheritance. Perhaps she wanted her name. He replaced the letters carefully, resealed the ribbon, and slid them into an inner pocket of his jacket. But he took one page, just one, and kept it separate. It was shorter, more recent. The handwriting is still elegant, but older, more rigid. The girl grows bold. She's begun asking questions. If she learns the truth, it will not just be her ruin, it will be all of ours. This must be stopped. I trust you understand what that means. There was no signature. But Poirot had seen enough handwriting in his career to recognize character through ink. Lady Wilmhurst had not written this, nor had the Major, nor Lucienne. No, it had been written by someone who saw themselves as a quiet custodian, someone who managed the house's rhythms without ever claiming a role of power, someone whose protection of the family had always been silent, methodical, unthanked. Eloise Featherby. Mon Dieu, Poirot whispered. He said nothing to Hastings. Not yet. There was still too much uncertainty, too much fog across the path. But a new clarity was forming, like an outline behind a glass. He spent the rest of the day walking the garden paths, replaying the last hours of Celeste Hartley's life, not just in action, but in intention. The way she had smiled at her cup, the way she had touched her sleeve, as if counting a rhythm, the way she had looked not afraid, but expectant. He paused near the sundial and turned to Hastings. She knew. Knew what? That someone would try to stop her. She baited them, not foolishly, but deliberately. She wore no necklace, but she left behind fingerprints of intention. She wanted the letters found if she died. And they almost weren't, Hastings murmured. But they were, Poirot said, because she trusted someone would see beyond the scene. That someone would question not just the crime, but its context. He drew out the single page again, held it to the light. She was clever, he added softly. But so is the murderer. A sudden gust of wind stirred the trees overhead, flinging wet leaves across the gravel path. And somewhere, in the deeper folds of the house, a door clicked shut. Time was no longer ticking forward. It was circling back. Chapter 11. Tensions rise. The house turned restless. By the next morning, a peculiar energy gripped Lachimore, a friction just beneath the skin of every conversation. The kind of pressure that made once courteous nods seem like veiled accusations, that caused tea to be stirred a little louder, doors to close a little sharper. Poirot had done nothing overt, had revealed none of his new findings, but silence, too, can be a lever. And now the house was creaking. Breakfast was notably incomplete. Matilda Crane did not appear. The Major was already 2 sherries into his morning by the time Hastings found him in the library. Featherby refused to speak above a whisper, her eyes unreadable behind rimless glasses. Lucian had not emerged from his rooms. Even Clarissa, usually meek and efficient, looked as if she had memorized every possible route of escape from the servants' quarters. Poirot, by contrast, seemed more composed than ever. He arrived in the breakfast room wearing a dove-grey suit, his moustache immaculately combed, his eyes razor-sharp despite the sleep deprivation no one else could see. He sat beside Hastings and calmly buttered a scone. "They feel it now," he said, "the weight of the unraveling. You see how the groups begin to fracture?" Hastings glanced around the table. "Lady Wilmhurst is barely speaking to Miss Featherby." "And Featherby," Poirot said, "refuses to meet anyone's gaze. She knows something is slipping. And Lucienne's absence. That is the behavior of a man doing sums in his mind. How many conversations can be remembered? How many letters destroyed? What might have been seen? He calculates not guilt, but risk." "And Matilda?" Poirot's voice dropped slightly. "I suspect Matilda has been delivered a warning." Hastings looked up sharply. "A threat?" "Of a kind, not overt, but persuasive." As if summoned by name, Matilda appeared 10 minutes later, pale, her hair damp from the mist outside. She said nothing as she entered, simply poured herself tea, then sat without touching it. Her eyes briefly met Poirot's. Something silent passed between them. Poirot stood and addressed the room with gentle finality. "Mesdames, Messieurs, I will require you all to remain here for 1 hour. Inspector Rivington and I must review several new discoveries. I ask that you do not speak to each other privately. You may sit in silence, if you please. The fire is warm, and the time will pass." Lady Wilmhurst blinked. "Are we to be detained like schoolchildren?" "Like guests," Poirot said smoothly, "in a house where trust has run thin." As the drawing-room doors were shut behind the assembled company, Poirot and Hastings made their way upstairs. They stopped first at Lucien's room. The Frenchman opened the door only a crack at first. His waistcoat was half-buttoned, and his eyes held a rim of unease. "Is this necessary?" he asked, before Poirot could speak. "Tout à fait." Poirot pushed gently into the room and surveyed the writing desk. "Have you been writing, monsieur? Or destroying?" Lucien's brow furrowed. "You think I am so foolish?" "I think you are so careful," Poirot replied. "Tell me, what did Celeste truly have over you?" Lucien sighed. "Nothing criminal, but enough to ruin me in society. We had an affair, yes, years ago, when she was barely of age. I thought she was in love. I was wrong. She had already begun collecting weaknesses. Not to exploit them, at least not then. But she remembered. And I knew that if she ever needed power, she'd use what she had." "Was it love?" Poirot asked softly. Lucien looked at him. "No," he said, "but it could have been. I failed her before I ever understood her." Poirot gave a slow nod, then left without a word. Downstairs, Inspector Rivington was losing patience. "We've kept them in that room for an hour," he hissed to Poirot as they reconvened near the conservatory. "Someone will crack, or explode." "They are already cracking," Poirot replied. "We have only to listen for the hairline fractures." Just then, a shout rang out. It came from the drawing-room. Poirot and Hastings hurried back in to find Major Prewitt standing, red-faced, while Miss Featherby sat motionless, her hands folded with practiced serenity. "She's accusing me," the Major barked. "She said I wrote that letter, that I told someone to silence the girl." Poirot raised a hand. "Calm yourself, Major. She said I wanted to cover up some ancient sin. That's libel, that is." "I did not accuse," Featherby said calmly. "I said that you knew the identity of the man who wrote the letter, and that you have protected him because it serves your legacy." The Major's lips thinned. "You think I care about legacy? I have no heirs, no title left worth the name." "But you do have guilt," she said softly. A tense hush followed. Poirot's voice broke it. "That is enough for now." But the tremor had begun. Each guest now sat more separately than before. The illusions of civility, the tea, the polite nods, the half-spoken agreements, were collapsing. They were no longer one group caught in a tragedy. They were suspects, circling each other with concealed knives. Later that afternoon, Poirot stood with Hastings in the upstairs gallery. "They are unraveling," he said, "and it is precisely what I wished." "You mean to make them turn on each other?" Poirot shook his head. "No, mon ami. I wish them to reveal what they fear. In their attempts to shield themselves, they will point, unintentionally, at the one person who cannot afford to be seen. The true murderer will not turn outward. They will retreat, become still, watchful." "And that's who we watch?" Poirot nodded. "We." He placed a hand on Hastings's shoulder. "The moment is coming. One more piece. Just one more, and the entire puzzle will shift." Downstairs in the drawing-room, Featherby sipped tea without trembling. Matilda wrote something on the corner of her napkin. Lucien studied the fire, and in the far corner, Lady Wilmhurst turned her face slightly toward the grandfather clock in the hallway, as if listening. It was not ticking, but the hour was close. Chapter 12. The Confrontation. The wind shifted that evening. Less a breeze and more a creeping draught that found its way through cracks in the windows and under the doors of Larchmore House. Candles flickered with uncertainty, and even the fireplace in the drawing-room gave off a wavering glow, as if hesitant to bear witness to what was coming. Poirot moved with purpose, though he spoke little. He no longer asked questions, no longer took notes. His eyes were listening now, watching, weighing. The guests knew something was coming, though none could name it. It made them speak more carefully. It made their silences louder. Dinner was a sparse affair. No wine, no coffee, just silence broken by silverware and glances. Poirot observed them all from the head of the table, where Lady Wilmhurst had uncharacteristically ceded her place. When the meal was done, he rose slowly. "Lady Wilmhurst," he said with his usual courtesy, "might I trouble you for the use of the blue study once more? There is one guest with whom I must speak privately." Her nod was curt. The others watched as Poirot led Matilda Crane into the study and closed the door behind them. She did not sit. Instead, she stood before the cold fireplace, arms folded tightly across her chest. "You know, don't you?" she asked. Poirot moved to the desk. "I know many things, but I do not yet know how far you are willing to go." Matilda's chin lifted. "I didn't poison her." "None, you did not. But you moved the cup." Her eyes flickered. "I only meant to frighten her, to make her think someone was watching. She was becoming unsteady, talking about releasing the letters publicly. It would have destroyed everything." Poirot stepped closer. "She trusted you." "She used me," Matilda snapped. "She asked me to deliver that first note to Lady Wilmhurst, the one about changing her inheritance clause. She said it was about charity, about building a school. But it wasn't. It was extortion." "So you shifted the cup," Poirot said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You placed it in the third position. You made sure she would pick it, but the poison was already there." Matilda's voice caught in her throat. "I didn't know. I swear to you, I thought it was a trick, a bluff, that she wanted someone to panic. I thought—" "You thought the game would scare her into silence." She nodded slowly. "But she died." Poirot returned to the desk and withdrew something from his pocket. The page from the letter, the one with the cold, unsparing command. "This must be stopped. I trust you understand what that means." He laid it on the desk. Matilda stepped forward. When she saw the handwriting, her breath hitched. "You recognize it," Poirot said. Yes." He turned, fixing her with a gaze sharp as frost. "Then say the name, mademoiselle. Say it aloud." Matilda looked as if she were swallowing glass. "Eloise Featherby." Poirot closed his eyes briefly. "Merci." He stepped back into the hall and nodded to Hastings. Moments later, Featherby was summoned. She entered like a figure carved from stone, her dress dark and severe, her expression unreadable. "You've drawn a circle," she said to Poirot without preamble, "and I imagine I'm now in the center of it." Poirot gestured for her to sit. She did not. "Tell me," he began, "what do you consider your role in this household to be?" Her mouth twitched. "I am the keeper of its memories, the witness to its decay, and its protector, when necessary." "Did you kill Celeste Hartley?" Featherby tilted her head. "You want a confession, Monsieur Poirot?" "I want the truth." "Very well," she said calmly. "Yes, I poisoned her." There was no gasp, no dramatic pause. Even Poirot blinked slowly. "You do not deny it?" he asked. "There is nothing left to deny. She was going to ruin them, all of them. She believed that unearthing scandal was justice, but it was only vanity. She wanted to be seen. She wanted to matter." Her voice was quiet. "But she already mattered. We all mattered. And the past is not a tool." Poirot stepped closer. "How did you do it?" She drank from the chipped cup. "I placed a trace of cyanide in the coffee pot." but only enough to settle in one cup, undetectable unless she happened to choose it. I knew she would. She always reached for symmetry, third from the left, always. Superstition. She told you this? She showed me, over years. Patterns, habits. She was predictable. Poirot's voice dropped. But you still wrote the letter, the one commanding someone else to stop her. Featherby's lip curled. And when that failed, I stopped her myself. There was a long silence. Poirot finally said, "You were never a governess, were you?" She looked at him, startled. "I've read your records. You were a private secretary once, to Reginald Wilmhurst's brother, not a tutor, but a guardian of documents. You entered this house not to educate, but to erase, and when that task was done, you stayed." Featherby smiled. It was thin and without warmth. "You understand me better than most." Poirot's expression was grave. "That is not a comfort, mademoiselle." He stepped aside and opened the door. Inspector Rivington waited outside. Featherby gave no resistance as she was taken. Later that night, Poirot stood alone in the hallway beside the grandfather clock. It had not ticked since the night of Celeste's death, and yet, in his ears, he heard it still. Tick, tock, tick, the rhythm of a life denied, the rhythm of justice, late perhaps, but certain. Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape. The following morning brought neither peace nor clarity to Larchmore House. The truth had cracked open like a pane of frosted glass, sharp, cold, and incomplete. Eloise Featherby was under guard in the East Chamber, awaiting the formal arrival of the magistrate. The drawing-room sat in silence, abandoned save for the dust motes that drifted through slats of half-shuttered light. And yet Poirot knew the story was not over. He sensed it in the way Matilda paced outside alone before breakfast, eyes flicking toward the carriage road. In the tremor of Lady Wilmhurst's spoon against her teacup, the way Lucien opened his mouth to speak and thought better of it. There was a final act left to play, one the house had not yet admitted to itself. It was Hastings who brought the first tremor. He entered the blue study shortly after 10, looking pale and clutching a folded sheet of paper. "This was found under the stairs," he said, handing it to Poirot. "One of the footmen noticed it while sweeping." Poirot unfolded the page. It was torn roughly at the edge, hurried, unsealed. A note in clean but urgent handwriting. "I must leave before the rest comes out. Eloise was not alone. There is more than one secret buried in this place. If I stay, I will be blamed too. I'm not made for disgrace." L.B. Poirot exhaled slowly, then handed the paper to Hastings. "Lucien Bellemare." Hastings nodded grimly. "He's already gone, isn't he?" Poirot rose. "Perhaps, but not far." They descended the stairs quickly. The main hall was quiet. Clarissa was dusting nervously near the baseboards. "Has Monsieur Bellemare left the house?" Poirot asked. She startled, dropping her cloth. I don't know. I saw him near the stables half an hour ago." He had a bag. Poirot moved toward the stables with haste unusual even for him. The wind had picked up again, tugging faintly at his coat, bringing with it the scent of damp leather and wood smoke. Lucien stood beside a saddled mare, speaking quietly to a stable hand who looked uncertain. When he saw Poirot, he straightened abruptly. "Monsieur," he said with a strained smile, "come to admire the grounds." Poirot stopped a few feet away. "It is not admiration I bring, Monsieur Bellemare, but concern." Lucien's jaw tightened. "I have given you everything I know." "No," Poirot said gently. "You have given me fragments, and now it seems you mean to vanish with the rest." Lucien glanced toward the road beyond the trees. "Eloise poisoned her." "That is the truth." "It is a truth," Poirot corrected, "but not the whole of it." Lucien's eyes grew sharp. "What more do you want from me?" "I want the missing letter," Poirot said softly. Lucien didn't move. The one Celeste gave you 2 nights before her death. The one that frightened you so badly you tried to persuade her to stay quiet. The one you burned, or pretended to. She trusted you, monsieur, and you betrayed her not with poison, but with silence." Lucien turned away. "I never wanted to hurt her." "But you did." He looked back, eyes glistening now. "She asked me to protect it, to keep it safe, but I couldn't. If that letter had come to light, if it had been published, it would have destroyed more than me. It would have destroyed Lady Wilmhurst." "Then you gave it to her," Poirot said. Lucien didn't answer. He didn't need to. Poirot stepped forward, lowering his voice. Celeste was not just an heiress. She was a ghost with a heartbeat. She walked this house with a name no one gave her and a truth no one wanted. And when she finally found proof of it, she came to you for protection. Lucien looked away again. "And what did you do?" Poirot said, quieter now. "You handed it to the very woman whose silence had defined her entire life." Lucien's voice cracked. "I didn't think she'd be killed." "No," Poirot said, "but you feared it enough to pack your bag this morning." The stable hand had disappeared. The mare stood quietly, reins slack. Lucien wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "What happens now?" Poirot did not answer with anger, only resolve. "You will stay. You will speak what you know, and in doing so, you will offer Celeste, finally, a name that was hers." Slowly, Lucien let go of the reins. He walked back toward the house in silence, Poirot beside him. Later that afternoon, the full company assembled once again, this time by Poirot's request. They gathered in the drawing room as they had days before, though now the chairs were more spaced, the eyes more wary. Lucien stood beside the hearth, no longer polished but frayed around the edges. Lady Wilmhurst sat in the high-backed chair, her composure brittle. Matilda stared into the distance. Featherby remained in the upstairs room, guarded, silent. Poirot addressed them with careful clarity. "There are always 2 crimes," he said. "The one that is committed, and the one that allowed it to happen." He turned toward Lucien. "Would you like to speak first, monsieur?" Lucien swallowed, then nodded. "Celeste gave me a letter. From her mother. It confirmed everything she suspected. That she was the child of a Wilmhurst, not just an adopted ward, but blood. The letter was meant to be shown, to prove her right to the family name." "And you?" Poirot prompted. "I gave it to Lady Wilmhurst," Lucien admitted, "because I was afraid. I didn't think she'd act on it. But I didn't trust Celeste to keep it safe either. I thought if I passed it on, the decision wouldn't be mine." "And so it wasn't," Poirot said. He turned next to Lady Wilmhurst. Her face had gone pale. "Madame?" She lifted her chin. "I read the letter, and I burned it." A sharp inhalation rippled through the room. "She was not a Wilmhurst," Lady Wilmhurst said quietly. "She was a mistake, a burden. I pitied her, but I did not owe her more than I gave." "And did you know," Poirot asked, voice like velvet over glass, "that Eloise Featherby had also read that letter?" Her silence was answer enough. Poirot nodded. Celeste's death was not born of madness or impulse. It was born of layered guilt, hidden truths, in the belief that protecting the dead was worth sacrificing the living. He stepped back. "The circle has closed," he said, "but I am not yet finished." Because there was one more truth left beneath the dust, one more revelation hiding behind the tick of a broken clock. Chapter 14. The final piece falls into place. Evening fell with a peculiar hush across Larchmore House, an unnatural stillness, as though the walls themselves were listening for the final truth. The rain had ceased, and a vaporous mist clung to the hedgerows and stone paths, coiling into the glass panes like ghostly hands. Within, the guests kept to their rooms. No music played, no glasses clinked, and yet Poirot walked the house with absolute certainty. The narrative was almost complete. He paused once in the long corridor outside the gallery where the ancestral portraits watched in oil-draped silence. One painting in particular caught his eye. Lady Wilmhurst's late husband, Reginald, captured in military regalia, the background a battlefield haze. His eyes seemed to follow Poirot as he moved, but the detective merely nodded to the past. "Your house," he murmured, "was built on omission." It was not to Lucien, nor to Lady Wilmhurst, that Poirot now turned. It was to the place that had first whispered contradiction into his ear, the clock. He descended the staircase and entered the hallway where the grandfather clock stood, motionless since the night of Celeste Hartley's death. He opened the glass door, ran his fingers along the casing, then pressed lightly on the wooden panel beneath the pendulum. It clicked. A false panel slid inward. Inside was a narrow, hollow space, just large enough to conceal a few sheets of folded parchment and a necklace. Poirot removed them carefully. The necklace was familiar, Celeste's signature piece, missing the night she died. A silver chain with a delicate pendant shaped like a small vial. Inside the glass was a faint residue, barely visible. Perhaps perfume once, perhaps something else. The letters were older. One, addressed in a neat hand, bore the same seal as the earlier documents Poirot had recovered from Lady Wilmhurst's music cabinet. But this one was unopened. He broke the seal and read quickly. The contents struck with precision. "To my daughter, should she ever find this. They will try to keep you small. They will call you someone else's child. But your name belongs to you. I have written down everything. I have told the truth, what he promised me, what he denied. If this finds you, it is because you looked beyond what you were told. And for that, I am proud of you. Your mother, Genevieve Hartley." The second letter was briefer, unsigned but written in the same narrow, cold hand that had composed the command to stop her. It was dated 2 days before Celeste's death. The girl will not stop. She searches even now. The clock, I think. She suspects it holds more. We must act swiftly. If you cannot reach her heart, then reach her fears. Poirot stood perfectly still. It wasn't just Featherby. She had helped, but someone else had known. Someone who had hidden the final letters. Someone who had placed the necklace, the evidence, within the clock after the murder. Someone who wanted the story of Genevieve Hartley to remain buried. And only one person, he realized, had access to every corner of this house, including the tools to open a false panel in a clock. Horace Bly. That night, Poirot asked to speak to the horologist alone. They met in the dining room, dark now save for the glow of the fireplace. Horace arrived holding a small brass gear in his hand, as though to remind himself of his usefulness. "I was told you wished to speak with me. Monsieur Poirot." "Yes," Poirot said calmly, motioning to the chair across from him. "I have a final puzzle to solve, and I believe you hold the last piece." Horace sat warily. "I've already told you all I know, but not all you've done." The color left the man's face. Poirot placed the pendant vial on the table between them. Then, slowly, the 2 letters. Horace stared. "Where did you—" "In the clock," Poirot said softly. "A hidden panel, crafted decades ago, but opened recently. By someone who understood its mechanism intimately. I didn't. You did." Poirot leaned forward, voice almost tender now. "You admired Genevieve Hartley once, did you not? Not romantically." "No, but you respected her. And when she died, you suspected there was more. You kept her letter. You gave it to Celeste, thinking it was the right thing." Horace's hands trembled. "And then she came to you again. This past month. She had found more. She told you she was going to expose the truth. That she would shame the family. Perhaps she even said you were complicit for remaining silent. Poirot waited. You were frightened, he continued. Not for yourself, but for the house, for the name, for the traditions you spent your life maintaining. And so, when Featherby hinted at a solution, you didn't stop her. You only ensured her success. Horace shook his head, eyes wet. I didn't poison her. No, Poirot said. But you moved the vial. After she died, you searched her belongings. You found the necklace. You knew the pendant might contain traces of the poison. You hid it in the clock. You destroyed the final letter. You tried to erase what she had uncovered. She was tearing everything apart, Horace whispered. The old names, the old structure. This house has stood for generations. I only wanted it to remain intact. Poirot said nothing. There was no victory in his face. No triumph. Only grief. You did not kill her, Poirot said after a long moment. But you helped bury her twice. Horace collapsed into the chair, shoulders caving inward. In the hallway outside, the grandfather clock remained open. Poirot stood before it once more, then gently pressed the panel shut. The compartment clicked back into invisibility. Beside him, Hastings watched in silence. You'll tell the others, he asked. Poirot nodded. Featherby will answer for the murder, but Horace, he will live with what he did, or what he tried not to do. Hastings exhaled. It's always the quiet ones. Poirot looked to the clock face, its hands still frozen at 9:13. She timed it perfectly, he murmured. She chose her death to mark the truth. He turned away, walking slowly back toward the drawing room where Lady Wilmhurst waited, pale and straight-backed, beneath the portrait of her late husband. She would not ask what he had found, and he would not tell her everything, not yet, because some truths, even when revealed, take time to land, time to take root. And time, Poirot thought, was the one thing this house had never truly mastered. Chapter 15. The final gathering. The drawing room was lit with deliberate care. Candles glowed in sconces, and a low fire crackled in the hearth. The chairs had been arranged in a circle. No more long tables, no dividing lines. Everyone would see everyone. No shadows to hide behind. Poirot had requested the setting personally, and Lady Wilmhurst had granted it with a nod that held more weariness than authority. It was, in many ways, a stage. Hercule Poirot stood at its center, the firelight softening the sharp lines of his silhouette. Around him sat the assembled players, Lady Wilmhurst, her spine stiff despite the fatigue written in her eyes. Lucien Bellemare, hands clasped tightly between his knees, shoulders no longer draped in superiority. Matilda Crane, notebook absent, palms resting flat on her lap. Clarissa, perched uncomfortably near the back, unsure why she had been summoned. And finally, Horace Bligh, pale and silent, seated farthest from the flame. There was one absence. Eloise Featherby remained upstairs under watch. But she would not be forgotten. Poirot waited until the room had quieted to the rhythm of breath and creaking chair legs, and then he began. Mesdames et messieurs, he said gently. The truth, like a melody, must be played to the final note before it can rest. We are here because a young woman has died, poisoned in this very house, among people she believed to know, among people who failed her. He paused, scanning their faces. Celeste Hartley was not perfect, but she was persistent, curious, and she was very nearly something this house was never prepared to accept, a rightful heir. Lady Wilmhurst shifted slightly but said nothing. Poirot continued. In recent days, we have uncovered letters, wills, and half-buried truths. We know now that Celeste was not merely a ward taken in from pity. She was, by blood, a Wilmhurst. the daughter of Genevieve Hartley and a member of this family whose name was quietly erased. Her inheritance was not just financial, it was genealogical, and she came here not to disrupt, but to claim what she believed was hers. He turned to Lucien. She brought her proof to you, Monsieur Bellemare, and you gave it to Lady Wilmhurst, believing, perhaps foolishly, that discretion would bring peace. Instead, it brought death. Lucien said nothing, but his head dropped slightly. Poirot turned next to Mathilde. You moved the cup, not with poison, but with intent to frighten her. You believed Celeste's threats would splinter the fragile order of this house. Mathilde gave a single, stiff nod. I was wrong. Poirot let the silence fill the room again, then gestured to Clarissa. You, mademoiselle, bore witness to more than you understood. The tray was unattended for only a moment, but it was enough. Someone introduced cyanide into the cup Celeste would take. A deadly prediction based on routine. A calculated murder. Clarissa's breath hitched audibly. And that person, Poirot said, was Eloise Featherby. A whisper ran through the room, though no one appeared surprised. She confessed, Poirot went on. She believed her act a form of protection of legacy, of silence, of structure. But murder does not preserve. It corrupts. She hoped to silence Celeste's story forever. Poirot's voice grew quieter. But there was another hand, one who helped bury what Celeste had risked her life to uncover. He turned at last to Horace Bly. You did not poison her, Poirot said gently, but you destroyed her chance at justice. You hid the vial. You buried the last letter. You feared what the truth would do to this place. But the truth was already here, and hiding it only gave it sharper teeth. Horace did not defend himself. Poirot drew from his coat a small folder, sealed now with blue ribbon. These, he said, are the remaining letters of Genevieve Hartley. They belong, by right, to Celeste's memory. They speak not only of betrayal, but of courage, of a woman abandoned and a daughter determined. He turned to Lady Wilmhurst. I will not ask for an apology, he said, but I will ask for a reckoning. Celeste may be gone, but the name she carried still echoes. Whether you choose to speak it aloud is now your choice. Lady Wilmhurst looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. Her voice, when it came, was very soft. I knew, she whispered. I knew from the beginning, but I was not brave. Poirot gave a small bow. Few are, but the hour is not too late. The fire snapped in the hearth. A log fell sparking briefly. Poirot closed the folder and set it on the table between them. Tomorrow, he said, the magistrate will arrive. Eloise Featherby will be taken into custody. But this evening, this is yours. This house is no longer a secret. What you choose to do with it, I leave to you. He straightened, then stepped back. For a moment, no one moved. Then Mathilde reached out, tentatively, and placed her hand atop the folder. No one stopped her. Poirot turned from the circle and walked toward the doors, Hastings falling into step beside him. They paused near the clock. Still silent. Still frozen at 9:13. It never ticked, Hastings said softly. Poirot smiled faintly. Oh, but it did, mon ami. Only once. Just long enough to mark the moment a lie began to die. He reached out and gently touched the casing. Now, he said, the house may breathe. And behind them, for the first time in days, someone opened a window. Chapter 16. The Reveal. The dawn that broke over Larchmore House was not warm. The mist had lifted, but the light that filtered through the windows was cold and hard-edged, a truth-teller's light, stripped of illusion and softness. It cast no romance on the ivy-covered stones, no forgiveness across the polished floors. But it was clear. For the first time in days, everything was clear. Poirot stood in the central hall at precisely 9 o'clock. The house was still, but not silent. Somewhere, A kettle hissed in the kitchen, and the low murmur of voices came from the servants' wing. Inspector Rivington had returned early with 2 constables in tow. One of them now stood quietly outside the room where Eloise Featherby waited behind a locked door. Poirot did not go to her first. He went instead to Lady Wilmhurst. He found her in the solarium, dressed in muted grey, her gloved hands resting on the arms of a wicker chair. Her face was composed but pale, her posture brittle like porcelain. "I presume," she said without turning, "that you are here to finish the business." "Not quite," Poirot replied, stepping beside her. "I'm here to finish the story." She looked up at him, unblinking. "It's already over." "Not entirely," Poirot said. "There is one final question. Not who killed Celeste, we know that now. Not why, for we have unearthed the motives of all who feared her voice. But there is something else. Something older." Lady Wilmhurst exhaled. "What is that, Monsieur Poirot?" "Who lied first?" She blinked, and he continued. "You see, murder does not begin with poison or panic. It begins with a decision, a moment where one person chooses silence over truth. That moment, Madame, was not Eloise's. It was yours." She turned away, her eyes on the glass. "You knew Celeste's parentage from the beginning," Poirot said gently. "You knew Genevieve Hartley had not been merely a nursemaid. You knew your husband's cousin, Aldrich Wilmhurst, had seduced her. You knew the child that arrived in this house was not charity, but shame." Lady Wilmhurst's voice was low. "And what would you have had me do?" "Give her a name," Poirot replied. "Give her what was hers. She would have destroyed the family." "She was the family." Poirot watched her carefully. "You could not bear to see the house you married into blemished, and so you raised her within its walls, but never truly inside them. You watched her grow with your daughter's governess. You denied her pearls, but gave her just enough to stay grateful, until she stopped being grateful." Lady Wilmhurst looked down. "I told myself I had done enough." Poirot was silent a moment. Then, more softly, "But she was always going to ask for more. The truth demands itself sooner or later." He stepped away and left her there, unmoving in the morning light. In the drawing room, the guests had assembled once more, not as suspects now, but as witnesses. Lucien sat with a distant gaze. Matilda beside him, her hands nervously clasped around a worn handkerchief. Clarissa lingered at the edge of the room, still uncertain of her place. Horace Bligh had not spoken since the night before. Inspector Rivington stood beside the fireplace, arms folded. Poirot entered without ceremony and took his place near the hearth. He began not with accusations, but with a single object, the small glass vial that had once hung from Celeste's necklace. "This," he said, "was meant as a symbol, a locket, perhaps, a scent pendant, but it became something else, a vessel of suspicion. After her death, it vanished, hidden not by the murderer, but by a man who feared the truth more than he feared guilt." He glanced at Horace Bligh. The horologist said nothing. Poirot set the vial down on the mantel. Eloise Featherby confessed to the poisoning. She measured the cyanide carefully, added it to the coffee tray while Clarissa was briefly out of the room, and counted on Celeste's predictability to ensure the fatal cup found its mark. Her confession is full, her reasoning plain. She believed Celeste's revelations would shatter the order she had spent her life maintaining. He looked around the room, pausing on each face. But Featherby did not act alone. She was emboldened by the silence around her, the silence of those who saw the storm coming and chose not to speak. He turned to Lucien. "You delivered the first letter." To Matilda. "You moved the cup." To Lady Wilmhurst. "You burned the final document that proved her inheritance. And perhaps, Madame, you would have let the matter rest forever, had she not returned with more." Poirot picked up the bundle of letters now tied in ribbon. "These are all that remain. Genevieve's voice, Celeste's proof the legacy that everyone here tried in one way or another to suppress. He placed them carefully on the table. Then, for the first time, he sat. "The case is solved," he said softly, "and yet I find no pleasure in it, only sorrow, for Celeste Hartley was not killed by poison alone. She was killed by the years of careful denial that led to it." The silence in the room was deep, and then Clarissa, of all people, spoke. "She knew," the maid said quietly. "That she was alone?" Poirot turned to her, surprised. "She told me once that people only looked at her when she was loud, that if she whispered, the house would swallow her whole." No one replied. Poirot stood and looked once more at the circle of faces. "You must decide," he said at last, "how the story ends. Whether it ends in silence or in truth." Then he bowed slightly and left them to it. He stepped outside. The fog had fully lifted now, and the first golden fingers of sunlight touched the hedges. The sky had broken into pale blue above the chimney peaks. Somewhere far off, a bird called once and then fell silent. Hastings joined him a moment later, hands deep in his coat pockets. "I don't know if it helped them," he said. Poirot nodded slowly. "That is not for me to judge. You think Lady Wilmhurst will admit what she did?" Poirot smiled faintly. In her own way, perhaps. Some confessions are not spoken, but lived. They stood in silence a moment longer. Then Hastings asked, "And you? What now?" Poirot looked toward the distant road, now beginning to dry beneath the rising sun. "Now," he said, "I leave them with their house, a house that has told its secrets, a house no longer ticking with lies." He turned. "And for me, mon ami? I find that I am ready for breakfast." And with that, he stepped back into the house, where the last echoes of a name, Celeste Hartley, still lingered in the air, no longer whispered, no longer denied. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. Justice, Poirot often reflected, did not always wear a uniform or march with clarity. Sometimes it came dressed in silence, sometimes in confession, and sometimes in the mere collapse of the lies that had once held people upright. At Larchmore House, justice had arrived, quietly but irrevocably. It had not announced itself, but it had entered the rooms, folded itself into the air, and made itself known. Eloise Featherby was taken from the house at noon. There was no scene, no outburst. She emerged from her room without resistance, her bag already packed, her lips pressed in a grim, unreadable line. She asked for no farewell. None was offered. When the carriage doors closed behind her and the wheels began to crunch down the gravel road, no one stood to watch it disappear. Poirot remained in the hallway as the constables departed, arms folded, eyes lingering on the trail of damp footprints Featherby had left behind. "She will be sentenced?" Hastings asked, softly beside him. Poirot nodded. "There is no doubt. Her confession is clear. Her motive, unpleasant but precise. She believed herself a custodian of legacy. In truth, she was merely a jailer of truth." "And the others?" Hastings asked. "Do they walk away unpunished?" Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned and ascended the stairs once more, walking the quiet halls with the unhurried grace of a man counting the last steps of a story. He paused briefly outside the guest wing where Matilda's door remained shut. Her notebook would remain unfinished, or perhaps it would begin again with a new story, one not drawn in shadows. He descended again and passed through the morning room, where Lady Wilmhurst sat alone. She was writing a letter, it appeared, with slow, deliberate strokes of the pen. She did not look up as Poirot passed, but she paused once, her hand hovering over the page, then resumed with what seemed to be resolve. She would write to the solicitor that afternoon. She would revise the will. Clarissa passed Poirot in the hall, carrying a tray with only a single teacup. She gave him a small, embarrassed smile. "You were right, sir," she murmured, "about the truth. It's heavier than it looks." "Oui," Poirot said, "but better carried than buried." Later in the library, Poirot found Horace Bly at the desk, his tools packed, his satchel nearly full. "I'm leaving tomorrow," the horologist said, eyes not quite meeting Poirot's. "There's no need to stay." Poirot studied him. "Do you regret your silence?" Horace looked up. "Every day." Poirot gave a slow nod. "Then let that regret become something else. Let it become remembrance." Horace blinked. "Of Celeste, of the moment you almost forgot who she was." They parted with no further words. Outside, the sky had cleared into an uncompromising blue. For the first time, the grounds of Larchmoor seemed to breathe. The peacocks near the fountain moved with unbothered grace, their feathers trailing like soft punctuation marks across the gravel. Poirot stood at the threshold of the estate, suitcase in hand, coat buttoned neatly. Hastings joined him moments later. "It's finished." Then Poirot gave a small smile. "It is never finished, mon ami. Only resolved." Hastings nodded thoughtfully. "There was a moment when Featherby confessed. It struck me how calm she was. No denial, no panic, as though she had convinced herself it wasn't murder at all." "She had," Poirot said, "because to her, Celeste was a threat to an order she had spent her life preserving. Featherby did not think she killed a girl. She believed she eliminated a danger. And the others let her." Poirot's expression grew serious. Each played their part. Matilda shifted the cup. Lucienne withheld the letter. Lady Wilmhurst buried the truth. Horace hid the evidence. None held the poison, but all held the story in their hands and chose to close it too soon. They began to walk toward the carriage waiting at the end of the path. "Will it happen again?" Hastings asked after a moment. Poirot tilted his head. "The murder? None. But the forgetting, perhaps. The human heart does not always learn from its confessions." As the driver loaded their bags, Poirot turned back once toward the house. Through the great window of the drawing room, he could see the grandfather clock, still frozen at 9:13. He stared at it a moment, then said, "It should not be repaired." Hastings frowned. "Why not?" "Because that is when she died, and when she lived most honestly." He stepped into the carriage. They traveled in silence for several minutes, the winding road taking them past hills and hedgerows newly bright with spring's early buds. Hastings, after a time, asked, "Do you think she knew she would die?" Poirot looked out the window, watching the shadows flicker and shift across the landscape. "I think," he said at last, "that she suspected she might, and she made her death louder than her life had been allowed to be. That was her final act of defiance. And her justice," Poirot nodded slowly, "is in the remembering." They said no more. But behind them, far beyond the bends in the road and the curtains of trees, Larchmoor House stood quieter than it had in decades. The stories had been spoken. The ghosts had names now. And justice, quiet, imperfect, but real, had found its place between them. Chapter 18. The closing remark. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived for Hercule Poirot at his London flat, written on the ivory stationery of Wilmhurst House, sealed in faded blue wax, and addressed in a hand that trembled only slightly. He opened it in the quiet of his sitting room with his silver letter opener and read it in full while his tea cooled beside him. "Monsieur Poirot, the house has changed. I do not mean its walls. They remain as ever, cold in the mornings and stubborn in the spring. But its silence is different. It no longer weighs upon the rooms. Clarissa sings when she thinks no one is listening. Matilda has begun writing again, though she insists it is only for herself. Lucienne has left, but not in disgrace. He wrote a letter to Celeste's grave. It was the most honest thing he's ever penned. As for myself, I have amended the will. What Celeste was denied in life, I cannot restore. But her name is no longer omitted. The clock, by the way, remains as it was, frozen. Horace left instructions never to repair it. Some things should not be made to forget, he said. I think I finally understand him. With reluctant gratitude, Wilmhurst Poirot folded the letter carefully, set it aside, and, after a moment of reflection, placed it into his leather case among the few things he kept from each case he could not forget. He did not need to reply. Larchmore House had said what needed saying, at last. That evening he dined with Hastings, who had returned from a brief assignment abroad. The two friends shared a modest meal near the fireplace, roast chicken, potatoes, and Poirot's particular fondness, a small plate of perfectly sliced beetroot arranged with geometric elegance. I read the news, Hastings said between bites. Featherby pleaded guilty. No contest, no defense. The judge said her sentencing will be swift. Poirot nodded. A woman like her knew she would not be acquitted. And she would not insult herself with a lie. She never explained why, Hastings said quietly. Why that night? Why the poison? Why then? Poirot dabbed at the corner of his mouth with a napkin. Because she understood timing, because Celeste had found the final piece, the last letter. She had begun to speak openly. She even told Matilda she intended to contact the press. Featherby panicked. She did not act from calm malice. She acted because she saw the last dam cracking. Hastings looked thoughtful. Do you think she was ever loyal to Celeste, even in some twisted way? Loyalty, Poirot murmured, is often confused with control. He paused. She raised her, in a sense, but always from the shadows. She believed herself the quiet steward of the Wilmhurst name. In her mind, Celeste threatened that continuity, but in reality... He trailed off and stared into the fire. In reality, Hastings said gently, Celeste was that continuity. Poirot nodded. They sat in silence for a while. The fire snapped gently, casting orange halos along the edges of the room. Eventually, Hastings leaned forward. There's something I don't understand. Only one thing, Poirot teased. Hastings smiled. When the grandfather clock ticked, once, briefly, was it Featherby who made it tick, or Horace? Poirot smiled. Neither. Hastings blinked. Neither. Poirot sipped his tea. It was Celeste. He let the words settle. Celeste tampered with the clock herself. I confirmed it in her handwriting, notes scribbled into the margins of Matilda's sketchbook, discovered later. She'd studied the mechanism with Horace weeks before, under the pretense of interest. She knew how to start it briefly, just long enough for the pendulum to swing 3 times. She planned the moment, placed her cup where it would be seen, and watched the house as it reacted. But why? To send a message. That time, her time, had come. That secrets buried for decades had awakened. Hastings shook his head, marveling. So she knew. She even anticipated her death. Poirot set his teacup down with care. She hoped it would not come to that, but she was prepared. She had set in motion a chain of discovery, should anything happen to her. Hastings sat back. She was the detective all along. Non, mon ami, Poirot said gently. She was the victim, but she refused to die quietly. He stood then, walked to the window, and drew back the curtain. London glowed faintly beneath a sky of broken clouds. Below, in the lamplit street, 2 children passed by holding hands and a scarf, their laughter muffled in the wind. Poirot turned from the window. There is a myth, Hastings, that the truth brings peace. Hastings tilted his head. You don't believe it. I believe the truth brings clarity, and clarity is its own kind of justice. He paused, then smiled faintly. But peace? Peace is something we must build after. They spoke no more that night. Poirot retired early, as he often did after a case that left its mark, and as he undressed, folding his waistcoat with care and placing his shoes precisely parallel by the bed, he thought of Celeste Hartley, of her fingers resting on a teacup, of a ticking clock started by her own hand, of a name denied and then reclaimed. And finally, as he drew the blanket over his chest and clicked off the lamp, Poirot whispered to the quiet, "Mademoiselle Hartley, your time has been heard." And somewhere, far beyond London, in a grand house no longer ruled by silence, a clock stood still, not broken, but complete.